Good afternoon, everybody. Hi. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. I'd like to welcome you today, this afternoon, to Westminster Presbyterian. Today we are sponsored by Westminster Events Committee to talk to our esteemed colleague, Sid Madhavan from the Buck Institute. And today's program is sponsored by Westminster Events, or we, as we like to call it. We were founded in 22 at the church, and our mission is to be a respectful forum for the sharing of diverse and informed points of view on important issues that impact Marin County. We do this by hosting speaker programs several times a year, and our goal is to help people throughout Marin County learn, connect, and grow in a thoughtful and welcoming environment. So a bit of housekeeping today. Our presentation is going to last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session for about 15 minutes. You were handed a few pieces of paper on your way in. One of them is yellow. Can everybody see your yellow paper? So this yellow paper is our evaluation form, which is super important for us. So if you would please, at the end of the presentation, fill it out, and you can either hand it to a volunteer or put it in the basket that's just outside the door. You also have another slip of paper that's questions for the speaker. That one is white. Can everyone hold that one up? Yes, thank you. And so during the presentation, if you have questions, anything that comes up for you that you'd like Sid to address, you can just hand them to a volunteer, and our volunteers will be in the sides. You can just kind of hold it up and pass it to the side, and we'll collect those, and we'll try to go through everybody's questions. But luckily, if we don't happen to get to your question, Sid has very nicely offered to stay for our reception so that you can talk more about the topic with him. So today, before we go any further, I'd like to ask everybody to please check your cell phones, that they're off. We've all been guilty of it. I know I have been too. Great. So now I'd like to introduce Polly Chandler. Polly's a member of Westminster Presbyterian and a coach and a facilitator for Third Half Advisors. It's a group that supports people over 50 to design healthy, purposeful, driven lives. Polly is particularly motivated to help people navigate the many transitions we experience after age 50: retirement, empty nest, relocation, encore career, change in health and community, and entrepreneurship post-retirement. Her goal is to help people thrive throughout the ages and stages.
All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to Westminster. I'm delighted to be here. And I come to this aging conversation with my lens, and I'm sure you have yours. Mine's a little bit unique. Unfortunately, my dad died when I was very young. I was a teenager. And so I, ever since then, have kind of viewed aging as a gift. A gray hair? Yes. All right. Wrinkles? I got it. My brothers and I all celebrate the decade markers. We got to be 40, 50. So it's kind of an unusual lens. There's no right or wrong lens on it. But today what we're going to do is start thinking about aging in this kind of explorer's way that you do. But just out of curiosity, how many have noticed that 80s are kind of becoming the new 70s? All right? And how many of you, just a show of hands, have been invited to a birthday party for a 90 or 100-year-old? Look at that, right? So the number of people 90 and older has tripled in the last 20 to 30 years. Here in Marin, we're looking at the average life expectancy is 85 years old. California, it's 81. The 65 and older group grew by 47% from 2010 to 2022. And by 2041, 42% of people in Marin will be 60 years or older, right? On top of that, 10,000 people a day are retiring. And many of them are going to live into this, what I like to think of as an encore career. I have many people I work with who we call them the indie crowd. I'm not done yet. All right? So we are delighted that you are here, and I invite you to be curious explorers today on this topic. And Sid, you have been amazing in your explorations, so I'm going to just read a little bit about his work that he's doing and leading up to his role now at the Buck. Sid is a USC Buck PhD candidate and USC Provost Fellow, working in John Newman's laboratory at the Buck Institute. He graduated summa cum laude from Virginia Tech with a BS in clinical neuroscience with honors, where he completed a thesis investigating environmental effects on dementia progression in aging populations. During his PhD thesis work, Sid has been working to understand how exercise and diet-related metabolites can be harnessed to promote healthy aging. He studied how these metabolites can bind to and induce the clearance of damaged proteins in the brain and the gut. His experiments utilize and provide preclinical support for compounds currently being tested in the Buck Institute clinical trials. Outside the lab, Sid loves being outdoors. He enjoys trail running and backcountry hiking, and both he and I volunteer for the Golden Gate Parks Conservancy. He does field work cataloging ground nesting bee populations on Mount Tam. He lives in Kentfield with his fiancée Sid and rescue terrier. And with that, welcome.
Thank you. Great. Hopefully all of you can hear me. Is the sound okay? Great, thank you. So if at any time I feel a bit quiet to you, don't be afraid to raise your hand, let me know. I'll speak a little louder. I'll be going off of the slides over here to my left. So hopefully it's pretty easy for y'all to see, but I'll be talking through them as well. And like Polly said, at the end, there'll be time for questions. I'm happy to speak to any of you in the reception as well if you have more questions that weren't answered during the Q&A session. So I'm Sid Madhaven. I'm a PhD candidate, so not a doctor yet, and I'm from the Buck Institute. And so if you've been driving north of here on 101, you've probably seen our Bonvillain lair on the side of the hill and wondered, what are they doing up there? Are they really doing research up there? Are they just kind of like picking things apart? And so I'm very excited to be able to tell you a bit about the research that we're doing at the Buck Institute, as well as the longevity field in general, and then tell you just about aging overall. So with that, there we go. So maybe I'll say a little bit about myself to introduce myself to you before I go on. And I'll show a video from our communications department before I go through the entirety of the presentation. So I was born and raised in Michigan. I'm not from California. I really miss the snow. I think that California doesn't really have seasons. People like to say that there are seasons. It's not, I don't know. It's not to me, at least. And so just before high school, I moved with my family to Northern Virginia. My parents live outside Washington, D.C. still. And so I finished high school there, and then I went to Virginia Tech in Southwest Virginia. It's a beautiful area. If you've never driven the Blue Ridge Parkway, I would highly recommend it, especially in the fall where you can see the colors that California lacks. And so as a graduate and a proud alumni of Virginia Tech, I'm very excited that Berkeley and Stanford have joined the ACC. It gives me real vindication during football season. The Stanford game was great this year for me. And so I graduated in 2020 and got to do a very nice lonely drive across the country to California. And so I've been working at the Buck Institute. I'm a PhD student through University of Southern California. So my home department is at USC, but I do all of my thesis research at the Buck Institute, as do all the other PhD students. And so I really enjoyed the hiking out here. My fiance and I, we both went to Virginia Tech, but now we live in Kentfield, and we have a rescue terrier. So if you see us around with our dog, don't say hi to us because our dog is very reactive. We're still training her. But otherwise, feel free to say hello. I guess I'll point here. So, and just as a reminder, I'm not a doctor yet. Even once I become a doctor in a few months, I'm not going to be a medical doctor. So please, anything that you take away from this presentation, do consult your primary care physician before implementing anything into your daily life. And with that, I'll go into our communications video. So all of the things that are covered within this kind of promo video from our communications department, I'll walk through in the presentation itself as well.
The Buck Institute is interested in understanding aging, not only to make us live longer, but to actually alleviate and suppress the development of diseases.
Chronic disease is the great health challenge of our time. Aging is the main driver of chronic disease. To eliminate chronic disease, we must harness the biology of aging so we can live healthy longer. The Buck Institute is the world's first research organization dedicated solely to the biology of aging. We work with the building blocks of biology to understand how we age.
The Buck is concentrating on really trying to go to the root of the problem, so understanding that we can sort of intervene really early.
The Buck Institute is probably the best place in the world to be working on aging because there's so many different aspects of aging that are being studied. It's key because no one lab can do it all.
Our scientific explorers are brilliant, curious, and committed.
The idea that you could actually develop drugs that slow down the aging process was really something that 20 or 30 years ago people thought this cannot be done. Not only can it be done, but we will do it.
The pieces are in place. And we are in a unique position to put them together. Our world is defined by paradigm shifts, created by scientific discoveries. The biology of aging is the next frontier.
We're working toward a world where healthcare is better. It's a world where if we can eradicate the aging component to disease, we're all going to live healthier and longer.
It's just an incredible vision that really will, surpass anything else that we've ever seen before.
We are inviting you to a future of aging without illness. It's happening today, and it's happening here. Join us.
Great. So now I'll talk through some of the things that were covered in that video and kind of introduce aging biology in general. So typically when you think of older age and chronic disease, there are kind of four familiar forms that you tend to encounter. So things like atherosclerotic disease, so like cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, cancer, so think any type of cancer, neurodegenerative disease, so things like Huntington disease, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease, and then metabolic disease, so insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. And so although you could be meeting only one of these four horsemen, really they're all just facades for death itself and for aging. And so the purpose of aging biology research and longevity research is to target aging itself. So instead of treating Alzheimer's disease and cancer and cardiovascular disease all as separate entities with different causes and different risk factors, because aging is the number one risk factor for all of these diseases, the goal of our scientific investigation is to target aging. So the analogy I like to use is if you're swimming along in the water somewhere in the ocean and an octopus comes up to you and it grabs you with one leg, are you just going to cut off that one leg and really hope that one of the other 7 legs isn't going to grab you, or are you going to try to shoot it in the eyes and really kill the octopus? So it's the same type of thing for aging research. Instead of thinking, oh, okay, like if we can stop Alzheimer's disease, then I'll just hope that I'm not going to get cancer. No, we should really be targeting the primary risk factor that underlies all of these diseases altogether. And so that's aging. And so, why is the Buck Institute really equipped to do this? So the Buck Institute is the first research organization in the entire world that was founded with the purpose of studying the biology of aging. And so this is really important because it gives us this expertise that a lot of other institutions don't have. We have a lot of employees from many different countries. This really gives us a leg up on being able to draw from expertise from all over the world. We're also a nonprofit. Not a lot of people tend to know that. We've only been open for just over 20 years, and we're in Nevada, like I was saying before. We're the Bond villain layer on the top of the hill. And finally, we have an annual budget of around $65 million. And I really like to highlight this last point because when I joined the Buck in 2020, our annual budget was about $22 million. And so it's really exciting to, even over the course of my time of my PhD, to see how much more money is going into aging research. And by large, and in a large part, the funding that the Buck Institute has is public funding. And so it's coming from the National Institute on Aging and National Institute on Health. And we do receive some private funding, but largely this is a lot of public funding that's now going into aging. And I don't know if our Congress and senators are tending to age and get older and they're interested in staying in office. But either way, it funds really useful research that's going to apply to everybody. And so, advance the slide. There we go. And so our institute is comprised of about 25 labs. And so each of these faculty members that you see here has a lab, and then they have employees that work within that lab. So postdoctoral fellows, graduate students, master's students, things like that, and staff scientists. And so what's interesting about the Buck Institute compared to a typical cell biology department at the University of Florida is that all of these faculty are not applying for all of the same grants. They don't have expertise in the exact same field. And that's one of the real rich, exciting things about the aging field in general, is that there wasn't a lot of ways to study aging only by saying, okay, I'm going to study aging. You had to be a biochemist and you study the biochemistry of aging, or you were a chemist or a biologist who was studying aspects of aging. And so having all of these people come together at the Buck Institute allows for really nice collaboration, allows for formation of new ideas, understanding things from different perspectives. And so instead of looking down the hallway and thinking, okay, all of these people are purifying proteins and they're all looking at the same protein, they're applying for the same grant, they're interested in the same endpoint, it's not like that at all. And so this was something that really drew me to the Buck and has made it exciting throughout the time that I've been there. And as the Buck adds more faculty, the type of research that the Buck gets to do is expanding. And so this doesn't mean that we don't collaborate with other institutions. We collaborate very heavily with UCSF and Berkeley and Stanford, as well as across the nation and across the world. But it means that we are able to focus a lot of the collaborations at home, and it gives us a lot of strength to do things quickly. And so, I'll go back. So what are the tangible outcomes of our research? So the goal is not to have everyone live to be 200 or 300 and spend about 100 years in chronic pain. That's not the goal. And it's also not the goal for you to be living all those years and not be able to do something with your life. And so really, the goal is to live a healthy life, maybe about 80 years, maybe 100 years if we're lucky, and live without needing any of those four horsemen of chronic disease. So our CEO has a really nice line that I like to use. Living to 120 or beyond 100 in general would be a really great side effect of a drug targeting longevity. And so typically, I'll introduce two kind of vocab words to you. So typically, the total chronological time that you spend alive is called your lifespan. So if you live 80 years, your lifespan is 80 years. And then typically, the average person spends about 7 out of those 8 decades very, very healthy. So this is termed your health span. So your health span is all the time that you can wake up and you can go on a turkey trot for Thanksgiving. When you get on the airplane, you can lift your carry-on baggage into the overhead bin without any issues, without throwing your back out. Things like that. So typically, your health span is not as long as your lifespan. And the goal of the Buck Institute is to expand our health span to be as long as our lifespan, or as long as we can make it to be. And how do we know that we can do this? We know that we can do this because there are people all over the world, termed centenarians, who tend to live over 100 years, and they do it in perfect health. So a typical centenarian might live 105 years, and they might spend maybe 5 years with one of those chronic diseases. Sometimes they might only spend a year or a month. Sometimes they just pass away in their sleep without anything happening at all. And so that's the goal of the Buck Institute, to make sure that we can all die in our sleep at 100 without meeting any of those 4 horsemen. And so, what are the measurable outcomes that you should be looking for? And so what should kind of signal to you that you should start to kind of be interested in taking action into your daily life? So there's activities of daily living, or ADLs, and a good kind of acronym to remember this is BADD. So these are things that you should have no issue with throughout the entirety of your life. So even when you're 100, you should have no issue bathing, walking, which is ambulation, toileting, transferring, eating, chewing, and dressing. Throughout your entire life, you should have no issue. And so in order to get there, you can't just start at 90 and start saying, okay, I really need to be better at standing up without using my hands to push myself up. You need to start those things as early as you can. That doesn't mean that if you're already 90, you can't start to make a difference already, but the earlier that you start, the better your outcome will be. And a good reference that I like to make is that you wouldn't keep all of your cash hidden under your bed until you're 65 and ready to retire, and then take it all out and say, okay, I'm going to put it in the stock market now. You're going to start investing as early as you can. The earlier you start investing in the stock market, as well as your own health, is going to lead to a better outcome. And so a really good way to kind of focus your ideas towards what you want to be able to do in the end of your life is by going through this exercise that was popularized by an MD called the Centenarian Decathlon. So the Centenarian Decathlon is kind of this thing in your head. When you're 100, you want to be able to do, say, 10 things. So when you get to be 100, you want to still be able to carry all the groceries into the house without making 2 trips. That might be a personal thing. Or another thing might be you always rent the same beach house at or you always rent the same lake house at Lake Tahoe. It has a whole set of stairs down to the lake. And you want to be able to go up and down those twice a day without any issues. So in order to get there, you need to plan to understand the eventual degradation that you'll experience throughout your life. So in order to be able to do that when you're 100, you need to be able to run up and down those stairs when you're 60. You should have no issue going up and down those stairs maybe 5 or 6 times, even when you're 80, because you understand that there's an eventual degradation. And so even though there's lots of scientists all over the world who are interested, in the Buck including, interested in developing drugs to target aging, that doesn't mean that you should wait until we come up with a drug to take an interest in your health. So this is a really great way to kind of focus your mind on what are my actual achievable outcomes. And so, how are we actually thinking about interventions with aging? So all the things that you might hear on the news or in the media, or things that your grandmother told you when you were young, things like eating well, exercise, sleep, having a really good support community, and then taking the correct medications, all these things hold true. But the purpose of the Buck Institute and the purpose of longevity research is to give you factual information and robust protocols for interrogating each of these pillars. For me to tell you that you should get a good night of sleep is a black box. For me to tell you that, oh, you should eat well, what does that really mean? If I'm to tell you at 65 you need to start doing weightlifting without any context, without what muscle groups to target, how long to take a break between reps, how many reps to do, it doesn't make sense. So that's the point of the Buck Institute, is to figure out these protocols and to give a molecular mechanism for understanding each of these pillars. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit, but one resource that I like to talk about is a free resource for physical longevity. And so this is not something that the Buck Institute developed. This is something that was developed in the EU, the European Union, and it's open source. And so this is a really great way, I think, to be able to start to do physical exercise if you're not familiar with any of the resistance exercise training. And so it's nice because this resource called Vivifrail has both a functional assessment, and then based on the functional assessment, it will give you a 6-week protocol for things you can do. So what's really nice about the functional assessment is it's very easy to do at home. It'll consist of marking out 10 meters, seeing how fast you can walk in between those 10 meters, or sitting up and down from a chair 10 times and timing how long it will take you. And so based on how quickly you can do each of those components of the functional assessment, you'll get a letter grade. And based on the letter grade, you'll figure out very quickly whether or not you fall into independent or kind of pre-frail or frail, fragile, or disabled. And based on that, you can go on their website and they'll give you that 6-week timeline for resistance exercises that you can do. So some of these are body weight, and then you'll move towards using actual weights. And so it's really nice because these are all things that you can do very quickly at home. You don't need to pay someone to tell you how to do them. It's a open source, very easy access thing. And so I encourage my parents, my grandparents, even if they're still independent, to go through these exercises, because like I was saying before, the earlier that you intervene, the better the outcome will be. And really, exercise is the best intervention, longevity intervention that we have. And so even 45 minutes of exercise in a week can lessen your chance of death by over 10%. And even if we come up with a longevity drug, I don't know if it's going to be better than lessening your chance of death by 10%. So if you can exercise, even if it's for 40 minutes a week of walking or going for a light jog, you should really think about doing that. And so now I'll talk a little bit about the work that we do in our lab. So my boss, the faculty member who's my advisor, his name is John Newman. And so he's a MD PhD. So I'm going to be getting my PhD, which qualifies me to do all kinds of scientific investigation. So John is an MD PhD, which means he also has a medical degree. And so he basically collected all of the degrees that he can get. He also has a master's. I'm just waiting for him to up and one day tell me that he wants to go to law school. But aside from this, he's still a practicing MD. He's a practicing geriatrician, which means that he works with older adults, and he works with them at the San Francisco VA. So if you happen to go to the San Francisco VA and you see this man, that's my boss. And so the purpose of our lab is to understand metabolism as it relates to geriatric syndromes of aging. So part of our lab is working with the basic science, which means working at the bench, working with animal models to understand the scientific side of what's going wrong with aging. And the other side of our lab works with clinical trials. So there's going to be a booth here at the reception where we'll have some of the staff from our clinical trials team to talk to you about the clinical trials that we've been running at the Buck Institute. Because the large majority of the clinical trials that we're running at the Buck Institute are run in the same concepts, using the same scientific concepts that we try to interrogate during our lab, in our lab. And so our lab, we have a couple postdoctoral scholars, so people who already have their PhD, and then I'm currently the only graduate student. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the framework that we think about aging through. So our lab specifically, like I was saying, focuses on metabolism. So what's interesting is at the Buck Institute, not everybody is focused on the same thing. I was talking about this before, that people are specialized in different things. So we have some labs that are focused on metabolism, like our lab. There are some labs that are focused on female reproductive health, some labs that are focused on senescence, other labs that focus on the chemistry of aging. And so our framework is understanding aging through metabolism. And so we're thinking about this through the framework that humans have evolved for metabolic flexibility. So what I mean by that is that we burn different types of metabolic fuel during different types of exercise and different types of metabolic interventions. So whether we're lifting something really heavy, or we're running for a really, really long time, or if we're sprinting as fast as we can, our cells are going to use different types of fuel to produce energy to make that happen. And we evolved to do this. We evolved to be able to sit for long, long periods of time, for days and days, without eating any food and focusing very intently. And the type of fuel that we would be burning is very different than the hunter-gatherer who's running after some bison to try and catch it, and still doing that on an empty stomach. And so with that kind of framework in mind, we think about the interventions that are interesting for longevity. And what's interesting is that a lot of these interventions that are related to exercise, related to fasting, are really robust interventions for longevity. So things like high-intensity exercise that deplete carbohydrates from your system, as well as fasting and starvation. These are the most, unfortunately, the most robust interventions for longevity across multiple models of animals. So in a fruit fly, if you reduce the amount of food that the fruit fly gets, it's going to be extremely beneficial for that fruit fly's longevity, their health span and their lifespan. Same thing in a mouse, same thing in a rat, same thing in a non-human primate, same thing in a worm, same thing in a human. And so a nice tidbit, a little bit of history that I like to talk about was a scientist, very thrifty scientist called Clive McKay. And about 100 years ago, he was running some experiments with his rats, and he was trying to figure out, okay, like how little food do I really need to feed them to keep them alive? And so he cut the amount of food that he was feeding them, and it ended up that the rats lived much, much longer than their counterparts who were allowed to eat as much as they wanted whenever they wanted. And so this is kind of where this idea of understanding metabolism as it relates to longevity started. And so we're interested in not telling someone who's on bed rest that they need to fast or starve for 2 weeks. That would really suck. And so the point of the Buck Institute, like I said, is to find molecular mechanisms to understand each of these things. So one iteration was using fasting mimicking diets. So things like caloric restriction, so reducing the total amount of calories that you intake is one of those examples. Another is the ketogenic diet, which was very heavily studied by my lab as well. And so the ketogenic diet removes one of the components of our diet. So those three components would be carbohydrates, which break down into glucose, fats, which break down into fatty acids and ketone bodies, and then proteins, which break down into amino acids. So when we're eating, typically we're consuming all of these things. A ketogenic diet removes all of the carbohydrates from your system. And in this way, we start to understand that all of these interventions, like the carbohydrate depletive exercise, the ketogenic diet, the caloric restriction, all these things that are really relevant to our longevity also tend to deplete glucose. And so why this is important is because our body needs energy. And so there's this molecule called ATP. This is an acronym. And ATP, you can think of it as the energetic currency for the cell. So anything that happens within the cell, you need to pay with this ATP. So whether you want to move one compound across a membrane, whether you want one compound to bind to another compound, anything that's happening in the cell, you need to pay. And so as you can imagine, it gets very, very expensive to run the cell. And all of your cells at all times are eating up this ATP. Your brain is the most hungry out of all of your organs. So if we're cutting out glucose because we're eating a little less, we're doing a ketogenic diet, we're running for a long time, what's happening in our body? And this is where the metabolic flexibility comes in. So instead of just withering away and dying, our bodies have come up with this really clever way of taking fat and burning it for fuel. So whenever we run out of glucose during any of these longevity mechanisms, we're taking fat and we're breaking it down into ketone bodies, and then those ketone bodies go all over your body to all of your organs and create that ATP. And so this is what really started our interest in understanding the role of ketone bodies in aging. And so we study all of the non-energetic mechanisms of ketone bodies. So I just told you how important ketone bodies are for producing energy when glucose is gone, and how this is relevant to metabolic interventions that are really relevant and important for extending our health span and lifespan. And so the nice thing about ketone bodies, unlike glucose, is that they do all kinds of other things once they get into the cell besides producing energy. So some of the things that they do is that they're related to our epigenetics. So if you've heard of modifications to which types of DNA are being read or not read, ketone bodies are telling and instructing the DNA to open up or close depending on which gene should be read. So pro-longevity genes are being read when ketone bodies enter the cell, as well as inhibiting the proteins that cause the DNA to ravel and unravel. Ketone bodies are known to be anti-inflammatory. They target a very specific inflammasome that's relevant to aging, and they've been associated with cognition. So this is something that we found really interesting and something that John studied during his postdoc. And the really interesting thing that kind of started me on my PhD was that ketone bodies are associated with depletions in amyloid. And so amyloid is depositions of misfolded proteins that occur during neurodegenerative disease. So these are proteins that get really, really sticky, get larger and larger, and then they sit and they kill cells in your brain typically. And so we were really interested in understanding the molecular mechanisms behind this depletion in amyloid. And so I'll kind of walk you through what the normal cell production of protein looks like, and then what it looks like with aging and neurodegeneration. So kind of the way that I like to explain this is using pasta. So when a cell reads the gene and produces a protein, the protein has no shape. You can think of this as like a wet piece of spaghetti. So it has no shape. And so every single protein that's produced has this, wet piece of spaghetti, limp spaghetti look. And so there are chaperones that come in and instruct that protein to be folded in a very specific way. So protein X will always be in the shape of rigatoni. And so the chaperones come in, they meet the spaghetti, they turn it into rigatoni. So once it's turned into rigatoni, protein X goes about its job, does its whole thing, everything is fine and dandy. But what happens is if the chaperones mess up and they fold that protein X into a rotini shape or any other kind of shape of pasta, there are mechanisms in the cell, in a healthy cell, to get rid of that piece of pasta. And so typically, once a protein becomes misfolded, you can see this in this top row, it gets a little larger and then it's degraded ultimately. So there's a really tight regulation of misfolded and damaged proteins in a healthy cell. So during neurodegeneration, so things like Alzheimer's disease, Huntington disease, as well as in aging, in all the tissues of our body, there's a higher production of these misfolded proteins. So there's a higher amount of this wet spaghetti that's being turned into the wrong shape. And so with neurodegenerative diseases, there are certain proteins that are relevant to each disease. So one that you might have heard of is amyloid beta and tau, as well as Huntington. And so these proteins, once they misfold, get really, really sticky, and they can coerce normally folded proteins to become misfolded. And so they'll whisper in that protein's ear, and then they'll add it to their little group, and they get larger and larger and larger. They spread from one cell to another, and then they kill those cells. And so we were really interested where exactly in this process are ketone bodies interfering, because we're seeing that there's less deposition of large proteins. And so what we found is that the ketone bodies, so typically there's this neurotoxicity where the misfolded proteins start to get larger and larger and larger, and then they kill the brain, they kill cells within the brain, whether it's by producing inflammation or by directly killing the cells in the brain. But it seems like these ketone bodies come in and they can change the structure of these misfolded proteins. And by changing the structure of these misfolded proteins, this allows for those proteins to get removed and degraded. And so this is really exciting. So even in an aged cell that typically would produce lots and lots of toxic proteins, you can add these ketone bodies in, and they'll take care of the brain. And so this is kind of one of these underlying explanations for why is this diet good for me, or why is exercise really good for me, and why is it good for my brain? It's because in some cases, these ketone bodies will be coming into the cells, they'll grab those misfolded proteins, and then they'll take them to the trash. And so that's exactly kind of what the takeaway from my PhD work has been, is that ketone bodies are coming from the liver, they go to the brain, and we've been specifically looking in the brain and the gut, and then they take out the trash. And so what's the kind of impact on a human? And so, like I was saying before, we've started to run clinical trials at the Buck, and this has been mostly running through our lab. And so all the clinical research at Buck started by understanding ketone bodies in a different context. So like I was saying before, if you've broken a hip and you're on bed rest and the doctor tells you to starve for 2 weeks because it's really good for your longevity, that doesn't work. And it also doesn't work to tell the person who's on bed rest to do a ketogenic diet. Ketogenic diets are very difficult to adhere to. You start to smell kind of bad. It's not fun. So we've developed, and other institutions have developed, these workarounds. And so we use these compounds called ketone esters. So this is a precursor molecule that when you ingest it will go into your stomach, and it gets broken down into these ketone bodies. You don't have to modify your diet in any way. You can continue to eat all the carbs that you would like. And so you can eat a donut and you can drink this drink and you'll be producing ketone bodies. It's a really wondrous thing. And so even if you take the donut and you take the drink, and half an hour later, you'll be producing as many ketone bodies as if you had been starving for a week, or as if you had just run a double marathon. And so we're starting to test how these compounds can affect frailty. And so in order to get to our targeting frailty trial, we had to first make sure that these compounds were safe and tolerable, well tolerated in older adults, because previously all of these compounds had just been studied in athletes, and typically in younger males. And so we ran our first trial. It was called BIKE. And so this is also why I kind of mentioned that we're a nonprofit. This clinical trial and kind of the birth of clinical trials at Buck was only made possible through a very generous donation. And so when we first ran this trial, which is now fully completed, we found out that ketone esters are very well tolerated in older adults. What we were worried about was mostly gastric distress, because you're consuming a lot of oil. It'd be the same as like drinking a lot of canola oil. And so everything was really great. And so then we were trying to understand in this next clinical trial, which is actively recruiting, it's called STACK. We're trying to understand if two people of the same age, same ethnicity, same weight, same kind of genetic background, they were both to consume the drink and they were to eat the same thing, are they going to be producing the same amount of ketone bodies at time X? Are they going to show the exact same curve, the same pharmacokinetics when they consume this beverage? And so that study is actively recruiting. So if you're between 20 and 70 and you're interested in participating, please feel free. And then starting in December and January, we're going to be running the trial that we've wanted to run this whole time, which is targeting frailty. So if you're pre-frail or if you're frail and you're interested in participating in our trial, please visit our booth, or please visit our website, and you can start to take part in the science that's happening in Marin. And then we have a couple other trials that are running. One is called MOVE, where we're studying older elite athletes. So these are athletes who have been elite athletes their entirety of their lives. And we're studying whether this has had a very positive effect on them or if it hasn't, and what kind of contributing factors are related to that. We're also interested in ovarian health. And so this is partnering with another lab at Buck. And so if you're an older woman who's interested in participating in this trial, it's not using the ketone ester, it's using a different compound, but that's going to be starting in December and January. And if you're just interested in giving blood to help us build a biobank, you can do that as well. So we're looking for people of all ages to just donate some blood or donate some other biofluids, and we're going to bank all of that anonymously, and then researchers at the Buck can use those fluids and other biomaterials to conduct their research. So like I was saying, if you're interested, please visit our booth, which is going to be during the reception, or visit our website. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about aging, there are a couple resources that I like to point out. So one of them is the Buck Academy, which was made possible from a grant by Navigage. And so if you're interested in kind of taking some more courses to understand brain aging or health in general, you can go online at Buck and you can enroll in these courses. If you're not into sitting at a computer and taking coursework, which I can understand, there are two things that you can kind of learn more about aging through, and these are both podcasts. So one of them is produced by the Buck Institute. It's called We're Not Getting Any Younger Yet. I would really recommend this course, one, because it's very easy to understand. So it's not produced in a technical way. This is just conversations between aging scientists about kind of what got them interested in aging, what's really driving their interests, where's the field going in the next 20 years. And it's secondly given by Gordon Lithgow, who has a very lovely Scottish accent. So it's very pleasant to listen to. And so the third resource is by Peter Attia. He's not affiliated with the Buck. He's an MD, and he produces this podcast called The Drive. He also has a book out called Outlive. So if you're really interested in doing a deep dive on cancer or neurodegeneration or VO2 max, anything like that, this is the place to go. He's very reputable. I prefer him compared to some of the other anti-aging podcasts that you tend to see out in the media. And I feel like he does really good due diligence in presenting all the material in a fair way. In all of his media, you can see all the references. So if you're interested in a 2 to 3 hour deep dive on a certain topic, this is the place to go. And so if you're interested in just coming to the Buck and listening to some of the science that's going on, we're holding these community seminar series. So if you're interested, you can hear from some of the faculty. And so we just had one, I think, earlier this week, which was the mechanisms of brain aging by one of our new faculty who came from Brown University. But then the next one is going to be in December. So we hold these about every month. I would say that the one in January that's going to be given by our CEO would probably be a really great one to go to. And so we've had really great turnout at all of these seminars, and I would really highly recommend going to these as well. And if you're interested in just kind of keeping up with general things that are happening at the Buck, we have a blog, and we have a newsletter that's put together by some of the scientists as well as the communications team at the Buck Institute as well. And if you're interested in supporting our research, if I haven't made it clear already, it does go a long way. So even though we're funded primarily through public funding, the grants and donations that we receive from the community really do make a difference. So like I was saying, the first clinical trial that we ran was only made possible by a very generous grant. So if you're willing and interested, please support our research. And you can do that online. And if you're interested in coming on a tour, it's a very beautiful building that we get to do our science in. And so on Tuesdays and Thursdays, around 11 a.m., we have tours at the Buck Institute. They're given by very knowledgeable and very friendly docents. They're typically older adults from the Marin community. And so you'll get to walk around, see some of the labs, and you'll get to see the space in general. And so Buck is also a very interesting architectural landmark. It was designed by I.M. Pei, who also designed the Louvre. And so this is why we have the kind of characteristic pyramid at the top of the Buck. So if you're interested in architecture in general, the Buck's a kind of cool place to visit and kind of check off of your list. And it's interesting going up and down the stairs at Buck. I.M. Pei decided that scientists needed a lot of invigoration while we were doing our work. So there's no right angles anywhere in the building. So when you're going up the stairs, it's kind of, like you're going at one direction, then you go another direction. So interesting building. I don't know exactly what he was thinking there. And so with that, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. And I like to put some comics at the end because I'm not just telling you to stand on your head. And I'm not telling you that you have to choose between the fountain of bacon and the fountain of youth. You can have your cake. You can eat it too. And it doesn't matter how old you are. You can always do something that's going to impact your longevity. So thank you.
like you. I'm from the Midwest too.
There we go.
There we go. I'll take those leaves. All right. So I have these questions, and gosh, these are really great. There's so many of them. Let's start with, you mentioned a keto diet and fasting as a couple ways of producing beneficial ketones. What specific suggestions, these or others, might you have for us to consider as possible lifestyle or diet changes?
Yeah. So one of the dietary things that I like to talk about is really thinking about your glucose spikes, how many glucose spikes you're going to be having, and how big they are, because this is really relevant to the development of insulin resistance and the development of type 2 diabetes. So when you're eating a meal, personally, I like to put all my fiber first. So if I have the salad, or if I have like beans and rice, I eat the beans first, or I eat the salad first. So by doing that, you put all this fiber into your stomach, and that's going to slow the absorption of glucose into your body. So then you're going to have a smaller glucose spike, and it's going to be over a longer period of time, or you just won't have as big of a glucose spike in general. So essentially what's happening in your body is that the glucose comes into your blood, and then it needs to get into the cells. And insulin comes out of your pancreas to let the glucose into the cells. And so if you're constantly having really big glucose spikes and lots of those glucose spikes, the insulin gets really tired of coming out and helping the glucose into the cell. And that's what type 2 diabetes is. So by kind of going on a nice walk after having a big heavy meal, or after any meal, and really kind of starting to not work up a sweat, but help your body along, or by loading your fiber first. These are really kind of easy ways that you can kind of make sure that you're not going to develop diabetes later in your life.
And you are in Marin, so there's several questions asking about wine. Where does that fit with the equation of ketones?
Yeah, with ketones and wine, I don't know if there's any like research with specific like ketone bodies in wine, but there was a lot of buzz maybe like 5-10 years ago with red wine specifically, and a compound called resveratrol that's found in red wine, because scientists, I think the study was in mice primarily, where they took that active compound, resveratrol, and they gave it to mice. And they found that it was longevity inducing. So it extended, I think, health span. I don't know if extended lifespan. The sad thing is that you would have to consume an enormous amount of red wine in order to get the dose that's needed for that resveratrol. So I think it's like on the order of like 100 bottles, like something ridiculous, like 100 bottles of wine you'd have to. So I think you would die of alcohol poisoning before you get like the positive benefits. I think like in the concept of like, oh, if we're thinking about Sardinians who are living in a blue zone of the world where there's a high percentage of centenarians, and we're thinking, oh, they're doing the Mediterranean diet and they have a glass of wine with their dinner, and this is like really helping them get along. I don't think it's necessarily that there's something in the wine. It could just be that they're coming together with and having this kind of community aspect. They're being really mindful about the amount of food that they're eating. And so it might not be the wine itself, unfortunately, but that doesn't mean that you can't have something in moderation. I think there's also like a lot of buzz recently about like a lot of longevity scientists being really anti-alcohol. And I think in moderation, I personally don't think there's really a lot of research that shows that it's that bad for you. I mean, a couple drinks a week is not going to be anything bad. So if it's something that, you know, as part of your lifestyle is going to be really helpful with you building community, and I think that's a good thing to kind of consider.
So there's a couple questions here around cognition and kind of like, you know, if I can't remember, you know, information, word retrieval, number retrieval, and is there a test for Alzheimer? Is there a test for dementia? What's the best way to kind of make sense of our own cognition if we're noticing differences?
Yeah, well, so there will be an eventual deterioration in everybody. That's completely normal. And so there are stages between normal and demented. So there's normal and then mild cognitive impairment, and then there's dementia itself. So there's this kind of gray area of mild cognitive impairment that a lot of people start to get afraid that they're falling into. And so as we're generally aging, you'll start to have some issues with word retrieval or remembering certain things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have mild cognitive impairment or that you have dementia. And so unless you have a clinical diagnosis, I would say this is like when you go on WebMD and you start Googling all your symptoms, like when you stub your toe and you're like, I broke my toe, now I broke my finger, I have cancer. It's not that. So if you start to, go to the grocery store and, I forgot to get cream cheese, like it's not the end of the world. And so I think there are a good amount of memory tests that are used in clinical practice and with clinical trials. But those don't necessarily line up with a cognitive test for Alzheimer's disease. And so unless it's a clinical diagnosis, it's not going to be exactly the same. So I think typically a clinical diagnosis with Alzheimer's disease, technically, it's not even a 100% diagnosis until postmortem because you need to open the brain and actually see that there are deposits of certain proteins in order to make the actual final diagnosis that it was Alzheimer's disease. So the doctor can be very sure that it's Alzheimer's disease, but it's not 100% until after death. So unfortunately, we're not at the point where we can do a memory test and say, it's Alzheimer's disease, or it's a certain type of dementia. But that's also kind of what some of the focus of research is to develop biomarkers and to develop these kind of methodologies to really start to non-invasively interrogate these diseases.
Right. So there's multiple questions about intermittent fasting, and if I wanted to do this, is there a protocol? How do I go about doing that? Can I do it and not follow a ketogenic diet? Just a little bit more information on if people wanted to pursue that pathway.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that if you're an older adult and you're suddenly thinking about changing aspects of your diet, I would recommend that you're probably not going to get as many positive effects from that change as negative effects. So if you've been eating breakfast for 80 years of your life and now suddenly you don't want to eat breakfast, I don't think that that's going to be as big of a benefit as incorporating something else into your daily lifestyle will be. So that's kind of the first thing. So if you're really accustomed to having breakfast, I don't think that suddenly doing this intermittent fasting is going to be super beneficial to you, as would be like incorporating more exercise into your life. The second thing is that there are lots of different protocols for intermittent fasting. And so there's intermittent fasting, there's time-restricted feeding. All of these things generally refer to cutting out the amount of time that you're eating. So one of these, for example, might be you skip breakfast and you only eat within an 8-hour window. And so the rest of those 16 hours of the day, you aren't eating at all. So for some people, this is really easy. And so with human research, you have to differentiate between whether or not in that 6-hour period you're getting a benefit because you're just eating less, or if it's something about eating within that 6-hour period. So if by doing time-restricted feeding, you're able to lose weight, and that ends up making you more healthy, it's not necessarily the time-restricted feeding, it's just the caloric restriction and reducing the amount of food that you're intaking. And so if that's good and that's working, that's great. And so a lot of people got on this train that the time-restricted feeding itself, the schedule, was what was really beneficial. And some of that was coming from animal data, where in mice, they saw that a 16-hour fast was really, really beneficial and produced all these ketone bodies and yada, yada. But mice have a very different metabolism than humans, and so after 16 hours, they start to produce these ketone bodies. And so with humans, it takes upwards of 24 hours, sometimes even longer, depending on the type of meal that you ate. And so if you're reading the scientific literature and thinking, okay, like the 16-hour fast, this is what I'm going to do, and in the mice, it was so helpful and it was great for their cognition, it's not necessarily going to translate. So I think the really important thing is incorporating things that are really robust. So I wouldn't necessarily say that changing your diet is going to be like this huge beneficial thing. I would say that incorporating more exercise into your life and different types of exercise, improving your mobility, and then changing the type of food to include more fiber, or if you're older, to include more protein. That's going to be a lot more beneficial than trying to figure out, okay, I'm only going to eat in these 4-hour windows, or I'm only going to eat in the 6-hour window. And so if it does work for you, that's great. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's very accessible to most people. And so that's, again, kind of where these ketone esters and these compounds that we're trying to test come in, because we don't want people to have to think about, okay, I can only eat during this time, I can only eat this certain type of food. To make a longevity drug that's really accessible, that's where the focus is.
Nice, great. There's many, many more questions, but I think we're going to have to fold with the questions, and I so appreciate it, and we'll let you finish.
We really want to thank you for coming. What is a fascinating presentation, and by the amount of questions we got, this is a topic that's hitting home and very interested for the whole audience. If everybody would like to talk to Sid some more, he'll be around for the reception, as well as we have several action partners that are listed on your sheet that are also have tables that you can speak with. So thank you so much for attending, and I want to remind you one more time to please fill out your evaluation forms and leave it at the basket that's just in the door, or hand it over to one of our volunteers. So thank you again, Sid.
Thank you. Thank you.
That is so fantastic.